You're tuned in to the MtG Cable cast, where they cover Magic, the Gathering Finance. All right? You don't know about it? You're tuned in right now and get ready to learn some shit. Buckle your seatbelts and light a blunt and get ready for the MtG Cable cast. Starring Reptar and Thirsty, them onion head motherfuckers.
Alrighty, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal Cast, and this week we're bringing you part one of a two-parter. And what we're actually doing is we're taking a look, and this is something that's kind of a discussion on and off again in the EDH community at large, and that's kind of taking a financial look at cEDH, what its impact is financially, what its drivers are. So to do that, we had to have a methodology. So with that, let's get it taken away.
So it took a little while. We've been kind of stewing on this for a number of weeks. You were lucky enough to give to me a cool Moxfield link that is updated, I think, automatically that we will be referencing, that basically scrapes a number of results pages for cEDH events and aggregates the top however many cards. Is like 100 and some
100
cards.
Yep. Yeah, it's 100 something.
We'll be linking to all that in the show notes, and it gives a really kind of cool look at the format. And we'll bring it up on the screen now, so you can see broken out by type. It's surprising to see that there's even a battle in cEDH. There's only one Planeswalker that matters. That's the Fairy Time Rattler, the 3-mana Planeswalker, and then the rest of the format kind of looks like you would expect when you break it down. And the more you look at this, the more you see this really wide spread of cards from all eras of Magic. It's actually pretty cool to see. It's a little more open than Legacy and Vintage, which also contain, all the cards. So what do we do here? Well, we've got to really break this down and kind of come up with some parameters, methodology, like you said. And we kind of came up with 4 major bullet points, each with their own set of subpoints. So first and foremost, we are looking at constructed cards only, not cards that were printed in Commander or supplemental products. So this immediately excludes cards like Dockside Extortionist, Fierce Guardianship, the One Ring. These cards were obviously printed for Commander, 2 of them Dockside and Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat. They were all in Commander products. The One Ring was printed into a supplemental set. That was basically meant to see play all over in constructed. You have Ragavan from Modern Horizons 2, Orcish Bowmasters again from Tor, and then as you take a look through the list, you just see a number of other cards that were just making into these supplementals exactly how WotC kind of wanted it. You do get the idea that a lot of the modern supplementals were meant for Commander when you see a lot of the mythics being represented in this list, so it's kind of a pretty easy cut. That was a very easy one to figure out. This next one, a little more difficult. No constructed cards obviously built for Commander. And a really good example of this, Smothering Tithe, Professional Facebreaker, a card that I've talked about as a pick for the podcast, Aetherflux Reservoir, and
Paradox Engine,
Panharmonicon. Now, this also extends to constructed cards printed before the Commander boom. Just because Commander wasn't represented back in 1994, 1995, when a card like Mystic Remora was printed, doesn't mean that if they were to print it now, it wouldn't be dedicated for Commander. We have an obvious card in constructed, Cyclonic Rift, that was printed just before the Commander boom, that really does not have any kind of constructed pedigree, but is all over Commander in variants. I don't think we actually see it in cEDH, but it is just an easy call out for a card like there it is. Actually, it's in list. It's an easy call out. The same thing goes for Rhystic Study. The majority of the Rhystic cycle, absolute poo-poo, except for Rhystic Study. But that does not have a constructed pedigree behind it because it just wasn't good enough then, and it wouldn't be really, it would be fine-ish now. But it was a card that was printed in a constructed set, so cool, it meets our first bullet point, but it really just seems to slant towards the casual crowd.
Yeah.
So we want to exclude these kinds of cards, and it was a very difficult. This one was probably the most difficult rule to kind of like bend and shape.
Yeah, and hone in on what we actually wanted to exclude, because there's cards like Demonic Consultation, which clearly have cEDH impact, were from Ice Age, but that also won a Pro Tour. So it has a constructed pedigree,
Yep.
which precluded it from this.
I'm glad you brought that up because you shamed me before the podcast. It was another card I had on this list, and you said, "Oh no, sir," and then did 30 seconds of research and gave me a deck name that Randy Bueller played at a Pro Tour that I was just smitten with.
Yeah.
So that's what we're looking at there. The next one, one that a lot of people who pay attention to the reserve list probably cling on to and understand, is that we are looking for notable reserve list growth that is not connected to crypto. It's not intra-magic and crypto growth. So that means something like Twister, Wheel of Fortune, Grim, Monolith, Mox, Diamond all actually have organic growth behind them. It doesn't really align to a lot of the Bitcoin and Ethereum graphs
Spikes
that you look at. When you look at the spikes, they happen before, after, all the way through. They plateau at different times, and so we're looking at these kinds of cards, and it is going to make our job a little difficult because when it comes to reserve, when it comes to the duels, power that. If there were other pieces of power besides Twister on this list, we'd have to sit there and comb through price history and line it up and start kicking things out, because this is not cEDH finance. This is people cashing out of crypto and buying the things that they want, the niceties in life, right? So we don't want those when we're looking at this. And then finally, all versions considered are the newest. So that would be the revised edition for dual lands, unlimited for power, and we are not considering variants. We are only looking at the primary printing for these cards because there is a lot of noise in these. So when we look at the duels, we are going to see a bit of movement attached to the various crypto spikes like we just talked about, but generally speaking, a lot of the growth is organic for revised. But the older we get, the more lockstep it's going to be with these kinds of booms. Similarly, power, when we look at unlimited, as we've been saying for years, it is still just waiting. But the collector set in alpha, the player set in beta, all saw their booms alongside crypto, so we tossed them out. When it comes to variants, they can be extremely limited in quantity, especially as you dig in and you look for foil etched, rainbow, etc. We want to kick those out because, again, small population, a lot of noise, and it's just easier to take a look at the initial printing of the card and evaluate from there. We have decent historic sales numbers across multiple platforms. It just makes for a better data set overall when you can have that many more data points. And so with all those little twists and turns in front of us, we started kind of cutting through this list. When we talked about it post-podcast last week, we thought maybe we would take a look at creatures because that should be pretty cut and dry. And I think I said sorceries because that also seemed pretty easy. And because we're splitting this into 2 episodes, we didn't want to spend a whole lot of time in episode 1 going over just a data dump here when we could cut it down. And when you look at the list and you dig in, it's actually creatures still, but also lands. That's actually a pretty easy breakout because there aren't that many lands that really got a cEDH push. It looks like there should be because the 10 dual lands are there. But interestingly, that's not the case when you go all the way through this. There are a lot of other factors pushing on lands, and a good example of this is something like Cephalid Coliseum. It's going to get a reprint in Modern Horizons 3. Fantastic. I've been playing this card since Dredge was a deck. I love it to death. I've taken way too much damage from tapping it for a blue to cast Careful Study. But at the end of the day, the push that we're seeing on Cephalid Coliseum isn't just for cEDH. There are other constructed formats putting pressure on it as well. We have Middle School and what's the other variant?
Pre-modern.
Pre-modern, putting pressure on it. Right?
As well as occasionally that legacy list that pops up.
Yep. I don't think it's in the Dan list that just got super popular. It's just kind of freaking people out.
Yeah.
But it's just a card that when you look at it, you're like, oh, this card is like $8 or $10 now for whatever reason. $16 before reprint. Why? It's got to be the cEDH players. Not quite. Other pieces of pressure. So when you cut through the lands, which are extremely popular, it is the highest population card. It's a lot of crap.
Yeah.
Little fact, a lot of crap. So if we start with creatures up top, or anything you want to talk about in regards to like our little path forward here before we cut in?
No, I think we're good. I think one of the important things here is, and this is kind of becoming more of like our policy, variants not considered does include secret lair printings.
Correct.
So, we're, as most of us, as both of us have been picking, it's look, what's the lowest common denominator version? Go for that. Not looking for people who are going for max bling. We're just looking at the base versions of these cards. So keep that in mind as we go through.
Yep. So basically, I just went down creatures, and really, after we put it through our little filters, man, it was really simple. I could only find 3 creatures that were really given gas by cEDH. The first one is Dranith Magistrate. 1 and a white for a 1/3. Your opponents can cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. This is a stacks piece in rate and casual commander. People hate stuff like this. This isn't being played anywhere else. This is going to be pushed by cEDH. And right now, this is climbing towards a $20 card. It is seeing a little bit of a retraction. I can't tell you why, because I don't really play cEDH, so I don't know if it's falling out of favor. But this started out as a nothing burger. This card was like a $2 rare when you look at the market when it released in September 2020, and it's just been climbing up ever since. I think this is a really good and clear example of people who play competitive commander gassing a card because it's great in that format. It does everything you need it to. Right? So you look at this card and you're like, wow, I can see why this is good. What's going on here? This is stuff. This is the data that's behind the curtain, below the surface, however you want to look at it. This is, cEDH pushing value. The next one, Thassa's Oracle. This one's a little, again, bit of a value rub. You're like, well, but come on, guys. This is played in Modern and in Legacy and in Vintage. It's got to be getting gas from all of them. You would be right, except for the fact that all those formats are basically done playing this card. Doomsday isn't really a deck in Legacy right now. I don't think anybody's playing Thoracle in Vintage. There's really no clear deck that plays it. And in Modern, Breach Combo, for whatever reason, just stopped being a deck like a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
It's not really being played there anymore. It is available in those formats, but nobody is playing it right now. So what's going on? Well, it is the competitive commander crowd, again, pushing this card. It is draining supply. It's a very easy win con. It is, I would assume a lot of feels bad in casual commander to Thoracle people out.
Sure.
But
there is, but meh.
Sure. Another good example of a constructed card, not meant for a commander, that is getting gassed by the cEDH community.
And I think the important thing on Thoracle especially is that Thoracle, the day it was spoiled, I remember being in the cEDH subreddit and people were like, this is a 3-mana win condition with Demonic Consultation that you can't interact with. It was already identified as the most efficient way to win.
Yep.
And it took a while for it to be adopted by those constructed formats as well. And sure, there may have been a push when it was played in those constructed formats, but the price has remained relatively the same even after a secret lair printing of this card. So you can see clearly there that based on meta use and everything, the price is still currently being driven by the cEDH crowd. Mm-hmm. And that's important because cEDH players spend money and it's becoming more and more popular with people as time goes on.
Yep. There's a bit of a dip heading into Wilds of Eldraine, which is basically the last time I really saw Doomsday being played in Legacy. So that was basically the last time I saw Thassa's Oracle in a constructed format. And then it's just off to the races. That's it. Mm-hmm. People just move in on this. Blue Farm is a very popular cEDH deck because it is resilient. It's, I don't want to say easy to play, but it's just a bunch of draw spells. And if you just wanted to go way far out of your way to play Thassa's Oracle in there because you're just going to Xerox away through your deck, cool, go for it. Otherwise, any other deck that plays black and blue, you can just jam this in. It doesn't matter how many colors you're playing. I'm sure the Sisay Toolbox list can play this if it doesn't. Like, why not? I don't think you're wrong if you don't play Thoracle. It is just easy, and it is definitely a win con that a lot of cEDH players, choose to engage with. And then the last creature that I found on this list that also costs 2 mana like the others is Gilded Drake. And this one's a little more interesting. This is our first reserve list card of the night. This is 1 and a blue for a 3/3. It flies. And if you've never seen Gilded Drake in action, it reads like this. When Gilded Drake comes into play, exchange control of Gilded Drake for target creature one of your opponent's controls, or sacrifice Gilded Drake. So you'll never get a free 3/3 unless you stifle the effect, but you basically just trade your Gilded Drake for the best thing somebody else has. They reprinted Gilded Drake effectively in Modern Horizons 3. I think they basically outmodded Gilded Drake, which is why the stocks graph is showing a bit of a downturn now, because, the new Gilded Drake is a removal spell. You don't necessarily need to keep your opponent's creature around. If the object is to just remove it from their control, you can put it in their graveyard. It is perfectly fine. Now, Gilded Drake, as a reserve list card, did beg that comparison, okay, of when did it spike? And when we take a look at the stocks graph, we see that it spikes starting in 2020, in March, and it basically ends its run in August of 2021. That's when it basically starts to truly just plateau and hold on before another downturn, compared to Bitcoin prices. So that's March 20. There was not really a run here. We had already seen, Bitcoin had spiked up and people were not quite exiting the market. Where was it in March? Jeez, it was
March
at a plateau in March.
Time.
Yep. So we had basically hit a plateau. We were actually starting to dip. Bitcoin was on its way down, and then August of 2021 is after its first spike to over 60K and on its way back down. So Gilded Drake started to spike before Bitcoin did and maintained its price through the spike. And so the latter half of that spike is related to what we saw in Bitcoin, but not the first half. The first year of this card's price increase, not really attached to what was going on in Bitcoin. Cool. That meets that little parameter. And so those are the creatures that we're seeing basically get gassed by cEDH. Gilded Drake is a fantastic card in Commander. I used to play it when the format started because you still own Gilded Drake. So when you
Zetru it back, you get it.
Or the Azor, what is it? Venser Planeswalker.
Yeah.
You just flicker your Gilded Drake because it says permanent you own on it. Like,
yep.
Poop, cool it back. Cool, pull it back. Or you could grab it with Shackles.
Yeah.
Vidalin Shackles, which is a hugely popular card at the beginning of Commander that is effectively falling off the face of the earth. Which is fine. This is all like goofy stuff you would do back then that transferred into cEDH to just shuffle resources around to make the game more difficult to engage with, to win very quickly. All these cards are pushed by that format right now.
Yep.
Like I said, I think Gilded Drake has been outmodded, so I would actually expect a crash on this coming pretty soon without like the need for not the creature swap, but to spend $250 on this effect because you can get a rare for Modern Horizons 3. Like, cool. Why not?
It'll be $5.
Yeah. Keep it. Easy. And then we come to the lands. Because like I said, creatures are very cut and dry. The majority of the creatures actually come from supplemental sets or commander sets. It's kind of ridiculous. And any of the constructed creatures that are printed on here are mono dorks that are not worth talking about.
Like Arbor Elf, Llanowar Elf. Quarter, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. There's really not much going on. Hullbreaker Horror did give me pause.
Yeah.
But people are playing that in Cube. People are playing that, I think, in regular Commander. It's just kind of a fixed Tidespout Tyrant. I think that's the card, right?
Yeah.
And
bounce.
Yeah, so Mr. Krabs did give me pause. This because I don't think this was a card that was printed with Commander in mind. Tidespout Tyrant is already not super popular, so I don't think WotC really expected this card to make it there. So it gets past that hump. I just don't think that Hullbreaker Horror is really that important to Commander, and it's not really getting gassed by Commander that much. It was seeing play in Standard for a little bit. It's a fine win con for slow games, but we're not to a point yet where I can like point even at regular Commander and just say, that's the driver for this $5 card. Not there yet, but it is something we can keep our eye on in the future.
Yeah.
Or for the future. Moving into lands. This was fun. I thought this was actually a really fun experiment here because I basically got to cut up the duels into 2 different categories. Those with blue and those without blue, and then overlay their stocks graph on top of what was going on with Bitcoin, which was a big pain in the ass because for about 2.5 years, and I'll bring this up so people can see it, Bitcoin really does nothing but sawtooth for a while and then crater. And so it's tough to kind of figure out where in the sawtooth and crater things were going on, where people were just deciding to shift assets and be a little loose and just say, okay, I made my hay. Now I want to actually actualize this money. And so I do think there's a little bit of that in the duels, but they all start so early. They all start around the same time that Gilder Drake did in this tank in Bitcoin, but well before it explodes up to 60K. It's hovering around 10 at the time that all these duels start moving. And their growth lasts until about the end of 2021, which is basically like the second time Bitcoin pops to 60. And then from there, they actually plateau or start trending downward. So more entering back into the ecosystem, which is a little weird to think about because if the people that are with this newly minted, effectively, just like free income are going to buy something like this, why would they just then turn around and sell it back into the open market? They made their money. Like, why do they need to float it back? I don't know. I don't think that's part of what went on. So I think we saw a lot of cEDH drivers in here. A lot of people moving into the commander space. You mentioned the stimulus checks, so we see a lot of that buying as well. And I think I have a note here for a couple of cards that I didn't lend to the duels, but I will. This is like the only quote from the Marvel Cinematic Universe I like. It's about like Earth is like, what the hell is this square? Why does everybody want this square? Please, we're just hairy monkeys or like hairless monkeys. God of Thunder, stop this. And he's like, sorry, you cracked open the box. This tells the universe you are ready for a higher form of war. So as people move into dual lands, I think they're telling their friends, the people they play with, I am now ready for a higher form of war. And they move through the ecosystem and start moving into competitive commander because dual lands are a small percentage increase to your win rate. It makes your mana better. It makes your deck function better. And so you are going to move naturally up the power scale. You're going to buy into the crypt and vault because you have the ability to, you have the extra funds, etc. Cool. Now, I chose 4 duels. I chose the most and least expensive non-blue duels and the most expensive and least expensive blue duels to take a look at. And those are Plateau and Bayou to start. Plateau being the cheapest. It started its run in May of 2020 and ends it in October of 2021. Bayou starts in April of 2020 and ends its run in December of 2021. Those are on the list. So when we take a look at the stocks graph for these and we see it doesn't really associate with cryptocurrency in general, we have to say like, okay, these are players moving into the space. Generally speaking, the legacy scene at that point in time was non-existent. People were playing webcam games, but Commander really blew up. Competitive Commander via webcam really started to take off. It's still a thing. Tournaments are run via webcam. So we can now play these cool cards that we are buying. Awesome. What keeps them afloat now? People can move back into Legacy, sure, if they really want to, but they can play competitive Commander still locally. A lot of shops hold competitive Commander events, proxy and not. While I have the cards, I'll go out, I'll play them. Yep. Tundra, the least expensive blue duel. It starts its run in June of 2020 and it ends it in September of 2021. UC, the most expensive blue duel, starts its run in August of 2020 and ends its run in December of 2021. So you can see alongside Gilded Drake. These all kind of happen at the same time. Like you mentioned, stimulus checks. People start to buy in here. People continue to buy in because they can play Commander on webcam. We see the birth of real like cEDH in earnest across the community. It gels, it expands, it explodes, and people start to buy in. They move in. They prop the price up for all of this. It's not just people moving from cryptocurrency into cardboard currency. This is long-term growth. This is sustained growth, and then over time, as we expected, a lot of the prices started to kind of tumble down a bit because people did need to recapture that money. The job market is still fairly hostile. Interest rates are skyrocketing, and people need to make that money back. So they do float some of these cards back into the ecosystem, which creates that plateau in price and eventual downturn, as we saw up until recently. Now things are starting to recover a bit more. They're not really moving with the Bitcoin market anymore. Otherwise, they would have looked like the Bitcoin graph that I'll bring up again, where it's just doing nothing but almost climbing a sheer vertical rock face. It's outstanding what is going on with Bitcoin right now, but not with these cards. So again, where's the attachment? It's the cEDH.
Yep.
The next two, Ancient Tomb, City of Traders. A lot of people didn't see these grow. They just looked one day and these cards were, I think City of Traders is like a $300 card right now, and I think Ancient Tomb is 100 and change. Right?
After multiple reprints too.
Yep.
Which, again, there's not constructed formats pushing Ancient Tomb.
Nope.
All of a sudden, you're not getting a surge in Legacy attendance. Although, God,
correct.
I hope we do for more
Legacy.
Legacy. But
the market on Ancient Tomb is about $85. City of Traders. This has just been a steady gainer because it's reserveless. So of course, a $350 card, and this is just a constant climb. This is what we're seeing. We see. Although with City of Traders, we do see a little bit more of an aligned bump to the early 2021 crypto run. So City of Traders does see that, but the growth after that is pretty much organic, and it just goes with what's going on with the boom in cEDH. And we did see a bit. The City of Traders is a little more worrying than Ancient Tomb when we look at the deconstructed format pressure on this card. There was a boom in Legacy because the format changed wildly with the initiative. And so the Boros initiative deck, the mono white initiative deck, which eventually saw a bunch of bannings, turned into the Boros initiative deck. Meanwhile, the Painter deck, the Rakdos Painter deck, was still putting up numbers behind the scenes with its dedicated following. And Chaos Defiler not being on Moto kind of suppressed results because they could only come in through paper, as that's how the deck was optimally buildable. So you have two decks kind of putting pressure on City of Traders, and I really don't think there are any new players moving into Sneak and Show that didn't already have the lands. So Legacy players probably did put a little bit of pressure on these two cards, but not as much as Commander players overall. To your point about Ancient Tomb, the reprints actually made this card really accessible, not the From the Vault, but the Ultimate Master reprint. That card is a good reason why, like, variance in this is why we're not really looking at stuff, because this just sits like it's a $20-some card for
forever.
2018 to 2020, 2+ years, and it just slowly creeps up to 50 in like another 18 months. Like, no, thank you. That's not the price. The price graph we want to look at. We want to see Tempest, which has a really long price history behind it, a really long sales history behind it, and tells a completely different story of a card that was actually really good and constructed for a while, goes to shit, and then starts picking back up as people realize this card is really good in Commander. This card is really good in cEDH. It is actually a little too powerful for Commander, so let's pull it back out of like our 5 through 7 decks and just put it in the 8s, the 9s, and the cEDH decks. So we see a lot of push from cEDH on Ancient Tomb. Now, the last two on this list, you and I had a back and forth about. Mana Confluence, that really starts this run of lands, is one that I hemmed and hawed on for a while. This card is just great in every format it's in, and so I didn't want to put it on the list. But at the end of the day, when Pioneer isn't in season, there's really not a lot that's putting pressure on this card outside of Commander. And cEDH or regular Commander otherwise, at this point in time, I think this card's like $50.
Yeah, 40 to 50, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's $49. It's $45 right now. It's hard to imagine a regular commander player wanting to pick up a card that just makes 1 mana of any color when instead you could just play the World's Tree or Chromatic Lantern or any other
Something
options,
like that,
right?
yeah.
So I think this isn't a hard assumption. I think this is a pretty strong fact that it's going to be a cEDH push.
Yeah.
So, like I said, you peel away Pioneer demand and you're left with cEDH.
And I think one of the important things, you make the distinction between casual EDH and cEDH, is that cEDH is a game of resource management more than anything else. When you need to be as efficient as possible to get as many cards as quickly as possible to win as quick as possible. So you run significantly more non-basics.
Yep.
And a lot of times you're running off 4 to 5 lands. So the importance of mana confluence is tantamount in that when you need access to every color of your partner commanders, of your Atraxa, of whatever. So that's where we wanted to divide that one, because this one is clearly one of those cards that is pushed by cEDH, where you need that efficiency. Where, like you said, drawing that dual land improves your percentage just a little bit more, and that's where mana confluence kind of comes in as well.
Yep, I wholeheartedly agree. And like I said, for me, the sticking point on mana confluence was the obvious push from Pioneer, and having to bring that up in the discussion because it is a little bit of a rub in the rules that we've set up. Although once, like I said, Pioneer's out of season and you set aside the fact this is like a $45, $50 card that isn't Nykthos, it's really hard to imagine that there's a lot of demand from Pioneer players for this. I actually don't even know how many decks it's in anymore, so when it comes to Pioneer. So I imagine the overwhelming demand is from cEDH. And then the last two, or you had something else?
I was going to say the last one was Gemstone Caverns. Or there were two. There were Gemstone Caverns and Cradle. And kind of the same argument applies to them, because when you first sent me the list, you didn't have those on there. And I was like, well, you don't have Gemstone Caverns or Cradle.
Correct.
But, I guess Legacy has an influence for those. And then we had the discussion where we kind of realized, wait, no, because there's not really a Legacy season.
Correct.
The decks that played Gemstone Caverns don't exist anymore. Similar to Thassa's Oracle and Mana Confluence, we should include these as cards that are driven by cEDH.
Yep.
Because similar to those other two examples, the prices persist through seasons. They persist through relevance. The people that are playing Elves have had their 4 Gaia's Cradles for a decade.
Yep.
Because they've been playing Elves in Legacy for a decade for some reason, which I will never understand. But they're not exactly causing a financial move on this card. And another example of Cradle is if you look at the gold bordered version. Well, when the original version got out of hand in price, all of a sudden you started seeing the World Champs version get a bunch of upward pressure on its price because people all of a sudden were playing it in cEDH.
Yep. Same thing with Monolith, with Grim Monolith, that is.
Yep. Yeah.
So you mentioned Cradle. Force of Will.
Yeah.
City
Onslaught
of Traders.
Fetches. City. Yeah. Yep. City's a great example.
Right. And a lot of that did also have to do with middle school and pre-modern, because they allow gold border cards. But once Commander players realized that the majority of cEDH events that they would be playing in allowed proxies, it was a very easy and cheap way to pick those up. So that falls under the kind of variance thing where it's just like, okay, this is another way to enter the format, so to speak, through these gold border cards. Let's pick them up. And there's not a lot of supply out there. They're kind of difficult to track, so set them aside. You mentioned for Cradle in particular, price memory on that. The reason I didn't want to look at Cradle was because of just that. Like you said, Legacy Elves players have had their Cradles for forever. Similarly, Vintage players have had their Cradles for forever as well. And when somebody decided, hey, if we put Workshop and Bazaar and Cradle in a deck alongside Walking Ballista and Natural Order, we can actually run Roughshod over the format for like 6 months. There was no question. Everybody had the ability to do this. Nobody was like, you got to ban Workshop because I can't afford 4. Like, no. There was no problem, no question. Exactly. Like, you don't want to see some shit. Like, that's what happened in Vintage for like 6 months.
Yeah.
So that's why I didn't want to put Cradle on here, was because there was this price memory attached to it. But I think it's a perfectly fine card to have on here. Similarly, Gemstone Cavern. That was something I saw on the list, and I thought, like, should I include this? I've seen it recently in cEDH and the pods that play at my store. I've seen legacy players playing this as well. And then my next thought was, well, it got reprinted and it still held a price. What was the first thing I remember happening with Gemstone Caverns where it popped? And it was that there was a modern deck from I don't know how long ago that ran, I think, 1 or 2 only.
Yeah.
And it did well on camera. And so sure enough, the card just disappeared from the market and was relisted at like $30+.
Yep.
So for me, taking a look at the graph and understanding what's going on with this card, it was like, okay, this is again price memory from a time this card did well once. Or there was all of a sudden this new demand for this card. So I didn't want to put it on this list. But again, to your point, this is a card that if it's not foundational to cEDH, it is very close to that. And there's not a lot of constructed appeal outside of this right now. But we're at a point in time where we can say the reprint dried up and the price that kind of floated along with it and the original one after the reprint, the demand came from cEDH players because the modern deck had been gone for years and nobody was playing this card in any other format. So if it's not moving in droves to constructed players that need 2, 3, 4 copies, but it is disappearing at 1x, well, what players are picking it up? It's going to be, as you mentioned, the players that want those edges.
Yep.
Right. And there's a number of ways to interact with this, so that people can rebuy it, so that they can they can proliferate the counter if they need to.
Yeah.
And really engage with this card in a way that makes sense for them. So that's really it for the first kind of chunk of cards. We're going to take a little more time going over sorceries, instants, and artifacts. It's 3 sections. Some of them, and enchantments. Some of them might be pretty quick. Some of them might take a little longer. We do expect this to go at least 1 more episode. There's the chance it does go 3 because there are some hefty cards to talk about in the upcoming sections. And it really is important that we level set up front the rules that we're putting forth in this experiment, in the data that we're looking at as we comb through it, and kind of exemplify that with a handful of cards that were easy to talk about. So this is episode 1 of 2 to 3 of us going over some of cards that are getting pushed by cEDH, what the data behind these graphs look like, the timelines surrounding them, surrounding things like Bitcoin and other bits and bobs in finance. And as we will discuss with next time, we will cover sorceries, instants, artifacts, and enchantments. And kind of break down what this means for the cEDH format on the back of WotC's request to basically try and wedge their way in, not as a TO, but as a supportive mechanism for the cEDH format, provided you don't run proxies. So, until next week, we are at MtG Cabalcast on Facebook, Patreon, and YouTube. And Twitter. I forgot Twitter. So if you want to get in touch with us on Twitter, I am at Halt, I am Reptar. You are
at Damon_Thurston.
And we'll see you next week.